All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this talk on cognitive biases. My name is Karolina Czarna. It's my great pleasure to be here. I'm a behavior scientist, and as behavior scientists, we try to understand human behavior and why people behave the way they do, and also predict their behavior and change their behavior at times. And today we'll focus on cognitive biases, which is just one topic within behavior science. We're gonna explore what they are. Yeah, oh, that's better. So we're gonna explore what cognitive biases are and how they can get in the way and what we can do to use them to our benefit. And we're gonna start with a short activity. So for those of you who can, if you could take out your phones, and I'm gonna ask you to scan a QR code. And I'm gonna ask you to scan a QR code a few times and get engaged in some activities. First, for this one, I will split you into two groups. So let this side of the room be group A, and this will be group B. Can group A raise their hand? Beautiful, and group B? Amazing. So now you have two QR codes, if you can scan one of them, group A, group B. For those joining now, hello, if you can scan one of the QR codes, just one please, and there'll be two questions. And don't worry if you don't know the answers. It's expected that you may not. Just don't overthink it. Try to answer the best you can. Try not to Google the answers, and I promise it's gonna make more sense later on. The second question, if you could put digits, that would be ideal. For those joining, please scan one of the QR codes, and if you can answer the questions, that would be much appreciated. I'm gonna give a few more seconds because I can still see people working. Okay, right, let's forget about the activity for a second. Okay, for those joining, please scan one of the QR codes and answer the questions, but I'm gonna move on now. Let's forget about the activity for a second. I promise it's gonna make more sense later, but now I just want us to explore what a cognitive bias even is, and I will ask you to scan another QR code, no groups anymore, and it's the last time I'm asking you to scan. I promise this should work for all other questions. And if you could put just a short description, a few associations that come to mind, what a cognitive bias might be. They should be appearing on screen if everything is working. Perfect. Okay, they're coming in. Prejudice is the main one. You need to be aware, scam. Okay, inaccuracy, implied. Okay, oh gosh, there are loads of them. That's great. But prejudice is the main one. Anchoring, subconscious, assumption, preconceptions. Okay. That's super interesting. So I'm gonna tell you what my definition is. It's a systematic error in judgment that would impact our decisions and how we interpret information. And the most important thing, I guess, is that it's a systematic error. So if I had thought that this talk was at 11 rather than 10, well, this would have been an error in my judgment, but it wouldn't be a cognitive bias because it's not a systematic error, hopefully. And for something to be a cognitive bias, we expect it to be kind of predictable and to present itself in various circumstances. So now I'm curious if you think you are more or less biased than the average person. If you could answer, okay, equally biased. A few people are less biased. Also more, okay. Okay, most people will say they're equally biased, but which is fair. But I just wonder if that's gonna change at all after the talk. Okay. That's fair enough. A few people are less biased, but most people are equally biased as the average person, and some people said more biased. Right, so let's dive into specific cognitive biases, and let's consider two scenarios. So imagine I'm asking you to put your hands in cold water for 60 seconds. 14 Celsius degrees is cold water, is gonna be painful. So imagine I'm asking you to do this for 60 seconds, and then another scenario is I ask you to put your hands in the same water for 60 seconds, but then for another 30 seconds in water that is slightly warmer, warmed up gradually to 15 degrees, which is also painful and unpleasant, but a bit less so. Which scenario would you prefer? And again, if you can vote, would you rather keep your hand in 14 Celsius degrees for 60 seconds, or 14 Celsius degrees for 60 seconds and then for another 30 seconds gradually warmed up to 15 Celsius degrees? Okay, well, the majority say 14 Celsius degrees for 60 seconds, which is fair, because why would we want to keep our hand in cold water for longer if we don't have to? Well, luckily this has been tested, and in a similar experiment, participants were asked to do exactly that. There was a short trial where they would put their hand in cold water for 60 seconds, then they would also put their hand in water for 60 seconds, and then another 30 seconds of slightly less cold water. And as you can maybe figure out from this slide title and the published paper as well, title is that most participants preferred to repeat the longer trial when they were asked afterwards which one was better. And if you ask yourselves why that's the case, well, we call it the peak end rule. So when we think about past experiences, we don't evaluate them based on some average of our experiences or kind of the duration. It's more about the most intense moment, whether it's positive or negative, and how the experience ends. So in this scenario, the experience ended on a slightly more positive note. It was slightly less painful. So people remember it as more pleasant and were more willing to repeat the longer trial. So how can we use it to our advantage? Well, we can, for instance, avoid scheduling unpleasant meetings or unpleasant events at the end of our days, because we're gonna remember those days as better. We can try to focus on positive elements of the experience. So if you think back and there is something negative that happened, you can try to focus on a positive peak, because the peaks are gonna determine how you remember the experience. Well, think beyond the middle. So think how the experience is gonna end, and if there's gonna be an intense moment, try to make it positive rather than negative, and try to save good parts to the end. And maybe there is a reason why desserts are served after the main meal, and so on and so forth. So try to add something at the end that's gonna be pleasant. Okay, another voting. So now imagine that I'm asking you to choose between guaranteed gain of £900 or 90% of chance of gaining £1,000 and 10% of chance of gaining zero. Which one would you go for? Should be the same QR code you used before. It seems to be working, but you can still scan it if you're joining now. Okay, so almost everyone prefers a guaranteed gain of 900. What if I ask you about losses? If I tell you you have a choice between a guaranteed loss of £900 and 90% of chance of losing £1,000 and 10% of chance of losing £0, which one would you prefer? Well, it seems to be reversed now. Okay, so this is a summary of what I've just asked you. There are two very similar scenarios, but one is about gains and one is about losses. And when I ask you about gains, you were going for a certain choice. Why would you risk not gaining £900 if I was telling you you had a guaranteed option of getting £900? But when I was telling you about losses, you were not so willing to take a guaranteed loss of £900. And this is kind of what I would expect. And also note that within each of these examples, 1 and 2, the expected value of 1 and 2 is identical mathematically. And I'm trying to be careful what I say here, because I know there are some mathematicians in the room. But that's to be expected, and we call it the reflection effect. So this basically describes people's attitudes towards risks, and they are reversed depending on whether the outcome is framed as a gain or a loss. So kind of as you saw, and this has been researched many, many times, when people are facing potential gains, they are risk averse. They would rather go for a certain outcome. And when they are facing potential losses, they would rather gamble and are risk seeking. And you may wonder why it's important. Well, it's important because if you come across certain information like yogurt that is 90% fat-free, that of course means it has 10% of fat. Or if I tell you that a treatment works in 95% of cases, it doesn't work in 5% of cases. So if your decisions depend on how I frame it, well, that's problematic. So what can be done about it? Well, you can simply ask yourself if you would make the same decision if I frame something as a loss or a gain, depending on what you are facing, and then see if you would make the same decisions. Okay, now it's time to look at your answers. The activity that you participated in at the very beginning. So you may already know that I asked you whether the population of Iran was more or less than 4 million people. What you may not know is that I asked half of you if the population was more or less than 190 million people. So thank you so much. Okay, these are the results. So I was actually interested much more in the second question, so what the population was, your best estimate. And as you can imagine, the group A estimated 30 million and group B estimated 97 million. I didn't run any statistical analysis, but it seems like the first number I presented made some impact on your decision and estimate in the second question. Well, as I said, it wasn't statistically compared, but don't worry because it has been tested. So in a similar study where people were asked exactly same two questions across multiple experiments, we can see this trend. When you were presented with a lower number, the lighter color, the estimates were lower compared to the higher number. And not all of them were significantly different, statistically different. You can see the mark with asterisks, but you can see that there is a trend. So we call it the anchoring bias. So this is our tendency to make decisions and be influenced based on the first piece of information that we encounter. So as it's illustrated in this example, if you see headphones that cost £60, but they have been discounted from £100, that's a slightly different scenario to when you just see £60. Because in the first case, the first piece of information that you encounter is that they are worth £100. So £60 in comparison looks like a good deal, but not necessarily in the second scenario when you have £60. So you can reflect and think if you can think of any other examples. I'm not going to make you use Slido for this one, but a few that come to mind for me are Black Friday prices, which is similar to what we see in the image. So we are often made believe that something costs more and then was discounted. So the first piece of information that we encounter is a higher price and we think like something is worth more. Many of you may know that the price of an engagement ring should supposedly cost 3 times your salary, which is again something that we were made to believe as a starting value. And some restaurants would also place overpriced items on the menu first within categories like mains, because then it sets your expectations on how much a meal should cost. Right. Now let's think if you would prefer a chocolate bar or an apple. And what would you choose? What you would choose now and what you would choose if I was to ask you to choose now for tomorrow. And if you think the answer will be different, where you are not alone. We call it the present bias, which is our tendency to place more value on immediate benefits over future benefits. That's why it's hard to go to the gym, or eat healthily, or sleep more, or save more for retirement, because we need to put an effort and cost up front for something that's going to pay off in the future. And we are wired not to. So as a result, we can often choose what feels good over what is better for us later. And I'm choosing this one because it's a very common one, and I think applicable, and a lot of us struggle with that. And there are things that can be done. So you can add immediate incentives. So rather than choosing the hardest workout at the gym, you can choose something that's maybe less effective, but something you like. And then you're going to have this immediate benefit in addition to the future benefit, and you're going to be more motivated to go to the gym. You can also decide before the temptation arrives. So maybe it's better to choose your lunch for tomorrow today, if you can. You can also try to reduce friction for good choices. If good choices feel hard, let's make them easier. And using defaults can also help. So once you sign up for something, just make it work. That should help as well. And we talked about the peak-end rule, so I wouldn't be myself if I didn't try to end with a positive, on a positive note. And this is an initiative called Save More Tomorrow. So I didn't want you to think that it's just, the cognitive biases are just for us to explore and find quirky effects, but they're also very applicable, not only on a personal level, but also on a wider level. So it has been recognized that a lot of Americans don't save enough for their retirement. And this initiative encouraged people to commit to saving more for their retirement, but not from today, but from a certain point in the future. And this helped overcome the present bias, because people didn't feel like they were putting money aside today, but this was something they were doing for later. But this also took advantage of this default and inertia, because once you signed up, you would have to opt out. It wasn't something that they would ask you constantly to do. And we also talked about loss aversion. We don't like losses. So this commitment to save more was always linked to people's raises in their salaries. So they never felt like they were suddenly having less money, because they would save more only if they started earning more. And this helped a lot of people earn more, which I think is a great example of how we can use overcome at least cognitive biases, but also somewhat use them to our advantage. So a few takeaways. I don't want to leave you with a feeling that cognitive biases are bugs and we are somewhat flawed, because they help us navigate the world. Heuristics and shortcuts are useful, otherwise it would have been very difficult to navigate. So they are there for a reason, but of course they can sometimes get in the way, as we saw. So if you want to make sure that you are not as susceptible to them as possible, well, you can slow down important decisions. So we know that cognitive biases happen mostly when we are rushed, or when we are under pressure, or if we are tired. So for important decisions, try to take your time. You can also try to use outside perspective. So try to maybe ask someone else for opinion. If you're buying a house, maybe don't rely on the first price that you saw, but do your research. Seek evidence that kind of is disconfirming your beliefs. So maybe try to think, what would I need to observe to think that I was wrong? And if you have any checklists or systems in place, that helps as well, because you think them through in advance and then you can use them, and you don't have to decide in the moment where cognitive biases are more likely to happen. Right, so back to the initial question, and again, there's not going to be a Slido to scan, but I wonder if your answer to this question would have changed at all. It's for you to decide if you are more or less biased than the average person, but the reason why I'm asking is that there is something we call bias blind spot. So people commonly perceive themselves to be less susceptible to cognitive biases than general population. Well, interestingly, you went for the option that you were equally biased, most of you, but that's if I was to ask you, are you more biased or less than the general population? Statistically, on average, anyway, people would think that if anyone, they are less biased. And I think after this talk, you may start noticing cognitive biases everywhere, well, and perhaps especially in other people. Thank you so much. If you have any questions or comments, I will be in the Q&A tent. You can also email me on info@unstuckscience.com. And if you can spare a few minutes to give me a feedback using the same QR code as before, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much.